here to hear, how about that tongue twister, from Eric Leach, who is our keynote speaker this morning. Eric was the Director of Government, or is the Director of Government Affairs at ICE Miller, where he works with firms and government affairs clients to develop and implement public policy strategies. His area includes K-12 education, higher education, workforce development, telecommunications. Prior to ICE Miller, you may recognize Eric because he served as the Deputy Director for the Ohio Governor's Office of Workforce Transformation. And so that's where some of you may have heard him present before. The presentation, the information he's going to share today, I had the pleasure of hearing him present in September. And I left it saying, holy cow, everybody we know needs to hear this information because it is so eye-opening and shocking that we all need to understand not only where our workforce is going from an Ohio perspective, but from a national perspective, and how do we all play into solving this problem, which is the workforce crisis that we have. So before that, at the Governor's Office, he served also as Director of Research and Policy for the independent colleges and universities of Ohio. So let's welcome Eric Leach.
All right, we'll try this. Morning, everyone. It was an early drive for me coming from Columbus, but 2 coffees and I think I should be ready to rock. Oh, did I do that? Awesome. Perfect. So how many folks have heard from people that there's not enough workers? From employers? How many employers have said it's because of COVID? Once the COVID hangover's over, the labor market's going to snap back to what it was pre-COVID. Unfortunately, they're wrong. The labor market is structurally changing, and it's going to continue to change throughout the rest of this century. And I think it's very important for folks to really understand what's driving these changes, because putting our heads in the sand thinking we just got to wait for the next recession, things are going to go back to normal. The new normal is a tight labor market in perpetuity. And so today what I'm going to go through, you're going to have to bear with me. We're going to start with a lot of excitement as far as where Ohio's at right now, what our future looks like. But then you're going to see some oohs and some ahs as we go through what the changes that are occurring, not just in Ohio, the US, but globally. But we'll end up on a high note. So you'll just have to bear with me as we kind of go through this. So some of the largest economic development projects we've got in Ohio right now include Intel. Obviously, it's a $20 billion investment, most likely going to be up to $100 billion as we reshore critical supply chains when it comes to semiconductors. We've got Honda, $3.5 billion, Ford, $1.5 billion investments into EV infrastructure as the automotive industry begins to transition to electric vehicles. We've got $13 billion worth of investment, new investment coming for data centers alone. Ohio, Central Ohio specifically, is going to be a hotbed for data centers, mostly because of our climate. We don't have earthquakes, we generally don't have tornadoes, we don't have flooding. So it's a great geographic spot to plop data centers, and that will continue to occur. We've got Abbott, Procter & Gamble, $500 million capital investments. We've got Joby coming, about $500 million in Amgen. So it's a mix of semiconductors, data centers, electric vehicles, advanced manufacturing, health, life sciences, drones, flying vehicles. So Ohio's got a lot going on. And how many people have thought we're just kind of on a roll right now? Well, we are, because if you look at the statistics, 2022, $31.5 billion worth of capital investments announced, compared to just about 7 to 8 billion is our historical normal. The number of projects Ohio's landing is going to continue to accelerate because funding begets funding. So really the Intel project has acted as a catalyst for a lot of different companies that may have not have considered Ohio before. They're really going to consider it. With everything that's going on geopolitically when it comes to China, the ongoing conflict in Europe, we are realizing, especially with COVID, we have to bring our supply chains back closer to North America so that we don't have to worry about where we're getting toilet paper if there's another emergency and other critical components. We can't have components made across 80 different countries spanning Europe and Asia, because if there's a conflict or there's a break in the supply chain, we're not going to have parts for vehicles, we're not going to have chips for our computers. The semiconductors, while they're coming back, is literally everything takes a chip now. Whether it's your smart toaster, whether it's your vehicle, your computer, your smartphone, etc. We have to bring these supply chains back, which is a huge opportunity for Ohio because we are a huge manufacturing state and that infrastructure never left. So we're having a renaissance as we bring these supply chains back. So that 2022, 31.5 billion isn't going to be an anomaly. It's not going to be 31 billion every year, but it's going to be a whole heck of a lot more than 7 billion per year. So those are some of the private investments, but there's also public investments coming online as well, which not only do the private investments require a workforce, but the public investments require a workforce. So broadband, COVID obviously laid bare the fact that you have to have access to high-speed internet if you want to do remote education, telehealth, or work from home. So Ohio is getting over $1 billion to build out its broadband infrastructure. That's a mix of both private and public money, both state money that the governor and lieutenant governor proposed and the legislature funded, plus federal money through the BEAD program. The most recently enacted state operating budget included $750 million for the All Ohio Future Fund, which is to get additional sites ready for mega projects and other smaller projects. Also, huge investments in our career technical education and training systems, $200 million for career tech construction, $100 million for equipment, another $100 million for equipment and training facilities at our colleges and universities. All this is going to require people. And so just think about the jobs alone. So EVs projected about 25,000 net new jobs by 2030. Broadband and 5G, that alone is 32,000 jobs over this decade, and it's only going to continue. So job growth in Ohio, 2021, 99,000 net new private sector jobs, 2022, 83,000. Don't have 23 data yet, but it's also going to be a strong year for private sector gains. We have the most jobs in history. July 2023 was when we hit that metric. It was just over 5.6 million jobs. We recovered all of our jobs lost from COVID in May of last year. And if you look, the last peak was really in 2000. So Ohio has really recovered from the early 2000s when things started to dip, especially after the Great Recession. Our unemployment rate is low. It's historically low. It's not quite July 2023 when we were at like about 3.3%, but we're hovering around 3.5 to 3.8% unemployment. That means we're pretty much at full employment when it comes to people looking for work. If you want a job, you can get a job, essentially is where we're at now. And typically, Ohio has historically had a higher unemployment rate than the U.S. average, but the last year or so, we've been typically trending better than the U.S. average. Okay, so we have low unemployment, record number of jobs. We have more jobs than we have people looking for them. So what you want to see typically is a 1-to-1 ratio. So 1 job for every job seeker. We're at about 2 jobs for every job seeker. So we don't have enough people to fill the positions that are open currently. And you can see we're at the lowest point that we have been in about 20 years. So just think about that. More jobs than people looking for jobs. All right, what about labor force participation? This is the most important factor. It's the number of people in a society that are participating in the labor force. Unemployment's one thing. That's the number of people who are actively seeking employment. Labor force participation rate better captures the fact that there are people outside of the labor force that aren't participating, aren't looking for a job. We're at about 62%, depending on the year, but 61 to 62% is a pretty good average. We have to get much higher than that. So we have about 39 to 40% of the population not in the labor force. Part of that is our society is getting older. We have more people entering retirement. COVID accelerated retirement, so they're technically within their working age years, but they took an early retirement. So some of that is part of it, but a bigger part of it is we have people who left the labor force, whether it was during the last Great Recession, that never came back. And we have to find ways to get them back into the labor market, because we're not going to solve the problem of filling jobs if we've got people who are of working age not participating in the labor market. And that gets to the next really important point that we're going to go down. This is going to get somewhat depressing, but I promise we'll come out of it. So when I was an undergrad, I took a demography course, and the words that my professor said have stuck with me ever since, which is demography is destiny. So understanding demographics is key to getting Ohio best positioned for what the 21st century is going to look like. The demographic trends of the 20th century are going to reverse in the 21st century. The 20th century saw ballooning populations, not just in the US with the baby boomers, but in Europe, in South Korea, in China after Mao, and we saw a huge population explosion. The 21st century, as we close out, is going to reverse the opposite way. We're going to have declining populations in many parts of the world. Some folks may remember the fear of overpopulation, too many people. How many people heard that? And we just were like, too many people, we don't have enough food, how are we going to take care of all these folks? That turned out to be wrong. We were able to figure out new fertilizers that increase our food production capacity. We found new ways for people to live, and so overpopulation is not a thing. Depopulation is going to be a thing. And so understanding that and what influences it is going to be critical for us as we move forward. So understanding demographics, this is slightly nerdy, but I think it's important to understand. There's a concept called the demographic transition, and it kind of explains our birth rates, our fertility rates, why aren't we having kids? This really does a great job of explaining it. So pre-industrial, before we moved into cities, before we had the Industrial Revolution, you had a lot of kids because a lot of kids died. You had high birth rates, high death rates. So you had to have 10 kids with the hope of 2 or 3 of them making it to adulthood. And additionally, we are also mostly an agrarian society. We had farms. The more kids you had, that's free labor. And so they could work on the farm. Then, this is the dates of the late 19th century, early 20th centuries focused more so globally. In the US and Europe, this happened earlier in the mid-1800s. But basically, death rates began to fall due to improved food sanitation, healthcare, medicine. So death rates declined, but birth rates stayed high. So you had a super high birth rate, and the death rate began to fall. So what did that mean? That means rapid population growth. So there's a lag between when I'm born and I get married and I think about having kids, I have to have 10 with the idea of 2 making it to adulthood. While these same people were alive and that was ingrained in their thinking, improvements in sanitation, healthcare, et cetera, began to occur. So more kids made it to adulthood, which led to rapid population growth. Then you enter stage 3. So this is about mid to late 20th century, early 20th century for the US, or late 1800s. So birth rates start to decline because of urbanization, education, et cetera. So when women get more educated, they tend to have less children. When a society moves from rural to urban, less children, because in a rural setting, children are free labor. They're an asset. In an urban setting, they're a luxury, they're an expense. And so people begin naturally to start to have less children because economically it doesn't make as much sense. So as the death rates fall further, the birth rates continue to start to fall. So the population continues to grow, but it slows down. That's the US in the 1980s to right about now. With the 60s with the boomers, that was the tail end of the boomer generation, birth rates really started to drop after that. And for a society to maintain its population, 2.1 births per woman. So the US was typically about 2.5, sometimes 3, pre-1900. We're under 2.1 now. We were about 2.3 in the 1950s and 1960s. Ohio right now is about 1.7 births per woman. So what that means is we're going to have less children. So stage 3 is you start to stabilize. Stage 4 is low birth rates, low death rates, so you maintain a stable population, or it's anemic growth. That's where Ohio's kind of been for a little bit. And then stage 5, no one's really hit here yet, but birth rates are super low, basically 1, which is where Korea and China are, and their death rates are low, and so they're going to have population decline. So if you go from having 2.3 children per woman to 1 in a very short amount of time, you're going to cut your population in half within a century. So I'm going to show some graphs next. So that's the size of the population since the beginning of time, essentially. And it essentially goes straight up in about 150 years. That's how much change has occurred since, so the Black Death, we saw a small dip, and then I might as well get over here to help. So this is 1400s. It's about 1700, and this is about now. That's just to give an idea of the impact demography has had on population. So what this shows is there's a delay between when people are born and a population surging. So the reason why that book came out, The Population Bomb, it was in the 1960s. That's because the annual births were 2.3%, some of the highest we've ever seen. Then it dropped precipitously, but we don't see the effects until 30, 40 years later when the population, which is the turquoise graph, starts to pick up. So in the 20th century, we saw unprecedented population growth due to improvements in medicine, sanitation, food production, etc. It raised concerns about the scarcity of the planet's carrying capacity. The population bomb, most people have heard of it. That book came out in 1968. Right around the time we were at 2.3% annual births. It's like, where are we going to put all these people? China put in the one-child policy because they thought they were going to have famine. And ironically, the policy that they put in to try and save themselves is actually going to be their undoing towards the end of the century. So this is the link, Christy. So I think you're about to see is going to be very helpful in visualizing the changes from 1950 to 2100. This is total population by country. Yeah. Can you, if you hit full screen to the right. Yeah. So it starts at 1950, goes to 2100, and these are all population projections from the United Nations. So if anyone still thinks China is going to be a threat to us, I think you just got to look at that graph. Because they're at the point now where it's either guns or butter, essentially. But if you look at the US, we're pretty stable. We're going to continue to be stable. The main reason why is there's really 3 key things that go into demographics. It's your fertility rate, so your births, it's your mortality rate, so your deaths, and then it's your migration rate, so the number of people coming in. So basically births minus deaths is your natural change, how a population will naturally grow, and then migration is how you can supplement it. If you lose more people, that's a negative. If you're gaining more people, that can overcome a lower fertility rate. And if you want to go back to the PowerPoint. All right, so that's the graph and a static. I wasn't quite sure if the video was going to work or not, so I wanted to include it. So, what's Ohio's future look like? It's not bad. It's honestly not too bad, especially compared to what we just watched. So, the Department of Development expects by 2050, as of last year, Ohio is going to lose about 5.7% of its population by 2050. That's about 675,000 people. And that's assuming current fertility, mortality, and migration rates remain the same. From a perspective across the country, Ohio is the 7th largest state currently. North Carolina and Georgia are likely going to surpass us by around 2030. However, we'll remain the 9th largest state well into the 21st century. So we're generally stable. Some of the southern states are going to catch up and pass us, but overall, not too bad. So what this graph here shows is the blue line is births, the orange line is deaths, the gray line is natural change, so that's births minus deaths. 2020 is an odd year, so we technically lost people that year net, which historically Ohio's always grown, but mostly that's attributed to COVID, increased mortality rates, etc. But we have to think about, we have to encourage more people to have children, but also we need to focus on how do we prevent early mortality? So how do we deal with the addiction crisis? How do we deal with making sure people are getting their annual screenings that they should be getting? Because every person where we can extend their life is going to help us with population over time. Good news on one front is migration looks pretty good. So from 2010 to 2020, Ohio had the first time in about 50 years we had positive net migration. What that means is more people came to Ohio than left. And we haven't seen that for a very, very long time. I mean, the 80s, we lost, 500,000 people to outflow. 2020, we saw, from 2010 to 2020, we saw about 61,000 net positive migration. So as long as we're bringing in more people, we can address parts of the issue with mortality and falling birth rates. So we've talked a lot about aging folks. We talk a lot about boomers, they're retiring, etc. The problem is not just on the back end that we have an aging workforce that's retiring, we have less young people coming into the workforce. The baby boomers was our largest generation ever. Gen X was smaller, significantly smaller. Millennials, which come after Gen X, a relatively larger population because of typically the children of boomers. And then the Zoomers, so everyone under the millennials, are even smaller. They're extremely small. So the problem Ohio is going to face is we have less young people to educate. So what does that mean for schools? What does that mean for our colleges and universities? We have 120 colleges and universities across the state of Ohio. What is going to happen to them when the 18 to 24-year-old population is shrinking? We have to be thinking about that, and that also means higher education institutions have to be thinking about, okay, there's less 18 to 24-year-olds. What are we going to do about that? We need to focus on upskilling, reskilling the incumbent workforce because that's where the enrollment's going to be. So it's not just about the total number of people in a society, it's also about the structure, the age structure. So the age structure of a population is just as, if not more important. So the reason why is a young population signals a need for schools, teachers, resources dedicated to early childhood development. An aging population indicates a growing need for health services, retirement homes, and other provisions associated with older adults. Regarding workforce, a large working age population is a driver of economic growth, productivity, etc. So the ratio of working age people to children and the elderly shows how many dependents the working age population supports. So from a demographic perspective, you want to see a pyramid, which is a large base of young people, and as you get older, it narrows, because the more elderly people you have with a smaller working age population, the more taxing it is on the working age population to finance the healthcare, pension, etc. of an older population. So a rapidly aging population puts pressure on healthcare systems, pensions, etc. It leads to labor shortages. A skewed age structure can create social and demographic imbalances down the line. That's China, one-child policy, plus they typically wanted males, so there was a lot of gender-based abortion during the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, etc. And so they have a really imbalanced age structure. Youth unemployment, so countries with a large youth bulge, basically a very large young population without appropriate economic opportunities, is economic instability, which is the Middle East, essentially. So this is what you want to see. Large base at the bottom gets narrower, because these folks are your working age people, and they're consuming. They're buying homes, they're buying cars, they're having kids and consuming a lot. Then you have folks up here who are making the most money that they've ever made. You know, their last child is out of the house, someone else's problem, and so they're paying down their house. They're making more money than they ever have, so the delta between their economic needs and their income is as wide as it's ever been, and so they're getting ready for retirement. And then they move into retirement, and then all that money comes out of the system. They move it from high-risk investments, which you do in your 20s and 30s, to stocks, mostly bonds. And so all that money's coming out of the economy, so you want another young, large group coming up to replace them. And so that's an ideal pyramid. It's generally what you want to see. Not ideal. That's China 2050. A large grouping of older folks at the top. All these young people are going to have to support all these people at the top. And so you don't want to see that, because that's when you're going to have real labor shortages. You're going to have extremely high taxes, because you're going to have to somehow finance all the older folks that don't have grandkids or children. Who are they going to live with? Who's going to take care of them, etc. Okay, so what about us? So this is the US. We have a chimney, essentially. That's not bad. That's stable. We can do that. What that means is we have generally the right amount of folks in each age bracket to replace them as they continue to age. So it's not a bad bracket to be in. Ohio, we're literally a chimney. So that's the good news from Ohio's front. We're not going to have an upside-down pyramid. This is a lot of information. Why is it important? So we need a whole of society approach to addressing the challenges that are coming. That means if you're in the K-12 system or higher education system or workforce development system, every single Ohioan is going to become even more precious as time goes on, because we have to make sure every Ohioan, as the governor says, lives up to their God-given potential, because we don't have many more people to go out and find. So that means we need to focus on addiction and recovery. We need to focus on second chance hiring. ODRC, the Department of Rehabilitation and Corrections, releases 19,000 Ohioans per year from incarceration. Those are 19,000 workers. So the state needs to focus on how do we equip them, train them, get them ready, so when they leave incarceration, they leave with a job in hand and more than $75 in a bus pass. If we want to address recidivism, we have to be thinking about how do we train them and how do we get them working ahead of release. And we also need to focus on keeping as many high school graduates in Ohio as we can, and keeping as many post-secondary graduates in Ohio as we can, whether they're in-state or out-of-state. Ohio is a net importer of college students. We import about 9,000 to 11,000 more college students than we send out every year. We need to do a better job of keeping them here. And then we also need to expose students to internships early. And employers need to participate in this, because the earlier they're building a talent pipeline, the earlier they're touching those students, it's a competitive advantage that they're going to have compared to their competitors, because they're all going to be competing for a shrinking pool of potential employees. And so we also need to reach deep into society and get the people who aren't in the labor force back in, because we literally need everyone off the field and in the game when it comes to workforce, because there's not a huge new population of people coming. So we're going to have to work with what we've got. The good news, Governor DeWine, Lieutenant Governor Houston have been laser focused on this. For example, they've been funding the upskilling and reskilling of Ohioans through Tech Credit and IMAP. They're funding internships for college students and high school students. They're funding industry sector partnerships so communities can come together to solve these challenges locally. They're focusing on second chance hiring and encouraging employers to participate, as I said, because we release about 19,000 individuals per year. And the governor specifically is very focused on mental health and addiction recovery. And then funding all the capital costs that are related to getting our career centers, our colleges, our universities equipped with the right equipment and programs for the new economy as we shift to a more tech-focused, skill-heavy economic system. The future's bright, but it's going to take business, education, government, all coming together collectively to solve these challenges. Because it's not government that can do it, it's going to take our business community, it's going to take our nonprofit community, and parents, and everyone else, even if you don't have kids, because it's all going to matter at the end of the day to come together to solve a lot of these challenges. So that's my TED Talk. Thanks for coming. More than happy to answer any questions. Thanks.
I'll start us because, I just run.
Yeah.
We'll see. So, Eric, we talk about all these people who are out of the workforce. Ohio has about 13 to 14% of our young people across the state who are not engaged in high school and or higher education and or a job. So from age 16 to 24, right? So we've got this huge, that's a big percentage of our state. The one thing I haven't seen is any big initiative to try to figure out why those young people are out and how we can get them in.
It's a tough question because there's a lot of factors that are going into it. For example, when I turned 16, I couldn't wait to get my driver's license. Literally, it was like, the day I could get it, I went and got my driver's license. Today, they're not wanting to even get the driver's license. So how are you going to get to a job if you don't even have a driver's license? And so I think part of it is there's these ancillary factors that are contributing to why they're not participating, and transportation is a big piece of it. And so schools need to be focusing on making sure every student gets a driver's license, because they're going to have to get to a job somehow, especially in Southeast Ohio. It's not like you can take the bus, generally speaking. But the Governor's Executive Workforce Board has a committee called the Young Workers Committee. So Sean Dunn and Director Dack and the new Director of the Department of Education and Workforce have a committee called the Young Workers Committee that's focused on how do we get young people who aren't doing anything after high school, so they're not going to college, they're not employed, they're not going into the military or pursuing a trade. How do we connect with them early to figure out how do we put you on a track? If you're not on a track, we're going to lose you here in a semester, and we're not going to know what happened to you or how to get a hold of you. So they're focused on how do we do interventions early to get someone into short-term credentialing and skilling, and how do we connect them with an employer ahead of graduation. So I think that's part of it is we got to identify, use data. We can use data to figure out who's at risk and find those people and get them the supports that they need to get them on track. Does that answer at all?
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
What does the job distribution look like? You mentioned there's lots of new jobs currently in Ohio. Are most of them more in urban areas or more in rural areas? And if there's more in urban areas, how does that affect rural communities?
Yes. So as far as the distribution of jobs, it's mostly in the urban areas. So it's Columbus, Cleveland, Cincinnati, and a little bit in Dayton. And the types of jobs, we're moving more to So think, let's say, semiconductors, electric vehicles, et cetera. They all use, the occupations are generally the same. So they're technology-based associate production technicians, essentially. So if you go into an engineering technology associate's degree, you can work at an EV plant or you can work at a semiconductor plant, essentially. They're the same skill sets, broadly speaking. So a lot of it's, there's going to be a lot of four-year level degree and higher positions, but the bulk, the vast majority are going to be in that one-year certificate level to two-year community college technical STEM degree. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And for rural areas, the good news is, in some sense, as the Columbus metro area continues to expand, the projects are going to get further and further out from the center, which means folks in Appalachia are going to be within a commute, driving distance to some of these projects. So there will be some spillover effect. But at the end of the day, Appalachia, Northeast Ohio, etc., you have to lean on what you're good at. So Northeast Ohio, that's manufacturing. It's making sure you're getting, as everything's reshoring, making sure we're landing those projects in Northeast Ohio because we already have the industrial plant. They don't have to rebuild it. We already have gas, sewer, water lines to a lot of these sites. In Southeast Ohio, it's leaning on resources and tourism. It's beautiful down here. It should be a tourism hotspot. We should be selling the fact that once we get broadband built out, folks can leave the coast and have a home in Southeast Ohio and work from home and participate in the economy that way versus having to drive into an office.
I have a friend from Georgia that lives in Atlanta, and he goes to family in Canada every year. And he just goes straight up Route 70, which is just an interstate all the way from Georgia to Canada. And he came and visited me once, and when he came visit me once, he had to come off of Route 70. And he actually went through Southeast Ohio, and he said, this is way more beautiful than I ever thought that Ohio could be. Because he's been going through Ohio for like 20 years, but he'd never actually seen Ohio.
Yeah, and so I'm a reverse transplant. I'm from Las Vegas, originally born and raised. Weird, people aren't actually born there. But Vegas is a little gaudy, so they like to talk and tout their stuff. It's very West Coast. Ohio is very humble, and Ohio needs to do a better job. Ohioans need to really talk about why Ohio is great, because we have a lot of good assets. So we need to stop being so humble, and we need to be telling people why we're a good state. So folks in Appalachia should be talking about the assets that you have. It's beautiful. There's hiking, there's kayaking, there's a million different things folks can be doing. And guess what? You're a day's drive from 60% of the population. You don't have to live in Wyoming. So that's, I guess, part of it is we need to do a better job of communicating about the assets that we have. Anyone else?
I want to add a comment. I think someone may be able to comment on this, Eric, but when we look at Intel, everybody's like, oh, but I believe Meg's just announced a business that will employ, 45, 50 new jobs in Meigs County that's related to Intel. And I think over in that Noble area, I'm trying to see if Chastity's in the room, but there are these now supply chain issues where we're going to see some of these other places. So we need to be thinking in Appalachia, A, tourism, and B, are all our kids ready for the STEM economy? And are all of our recovery reentry people where can they fit best in those kind of two big pockets? And we'll always have health care. I just want to add that because someone just told me those are coming.
Yeah, that's a great point. And so the state's also been trying very proactively to try and incentivize additional supply chains to come to Southeast Ohio and other areas of the state outside the big 3 Cs. So part of the All Ohio Future Fund is to get some of these smaller areas site ready, because to your point, that's a great example. So Intel, you think one plant, but because of that one plant, we're going to have hundreds of suppliers that are going to relocate operations to help feed that plant. And those are all going to be job opportunities, and they're not going to all be literally right next to Intel. They're going to be farther away. In Southeast Ohio, especially as you get like Chillicothe specifically, because it's not too far from Columbus, are going to be great spots for folks to put down operations. So, yeah.
I have a question about Ohio and nationwide. How do you know how building trades is being addressed because of the number of people that have been trained to do these things? They're growing much older, and there's fewer people seem to go in there into those types of trades. And how will it impact Ohio and other parts of our nation in the future when there's nobody that knows how to lay brick and plumbing and HVAC?
So you just hit the nail on the head of a huge problem we have. See all those capital investment numbers? That takes concrete and steel. To lay fiber for broadband, we need people who have been trained in the skilled trades. And the problem is we don't have enough people. So the state has a broadband 5G sector partnership. It's a statewide strategy to address that, at least on the telecom side. But to your point, on the trade side, we have a definitive time where we need to train and reskill people, get ready, because once you hit about 60 in the skilled trades, it's not like you're in a white-collar job where you can keep pushing your retirement out. At some point, physically, you're not able to do the job. And so if we don't fill these positions and get the new people in, how are we going to build all the roads and bridges that we need? And so yes, you're totally right. The fact that if we don't address the skilled trades, a lot of these projects can't get off the ground. We're not going to build out $42.5 billion worth of broadband across the country in 5 years if we don't have people who are trained to dig trenches, lay fiber and conduit, climb towers, put on fixed wireless, etc. And that's like that across the board. The IRA, we spent about $1 trillion on infrastructure almost between all the different bills. Who's going to build all that? Robots can't do it. People sitting at home or in an office aren't going to do it. It's people who are going out into the field. The problem is we don't have enough people who want to do it. And part of it is marketing. You know, working in construction isn't the same as it was 30 years ago. There's a lot of technology integrated into construction now, and so getting folks to understand what those opportunities are, I think, will help the industry. But yes, it's a huge issue.
You spoke earlier about the infrastructure in Ohio, the gas and things that we have already in place in that central corridor. What about the electricity? I know in our area we lost 2 power plants within like 8 years ago. So, what you described as those billion-dollar investments all are high energy users.
Yes, so that's also going to be a critical issue that we don't have a lot of runway on. So power generation is going to be a very tricky item we have to deal with because those data centers, they're great, but they consume a ton of electricity. Intel is going to consume a ton of electricity, and we don't have any new plants coming online. And we share a grid, so we're on the PJM interconnected grid. So we share not just our own electricity, but we're sharing it with Illinois, Indiana, Pennsylvania, etc. And so the fact that they're also not building is contributing to the issue. And so what that means is we have to find ways to generate additional electricity, otherwise there will be shortages. It's 0.0 what's going to happen. The good news is the governor and lieutenant governor are focused on this. The Ohio Manufacturers Association has raised this as a huge issue. So hopefully we'll have some resolution to it. But it can't just be Ohio, it's got to be the entire Midwest that's focused on additional generation. But you're pointing out a very important issue, especially with EVs coming online and everything else. Where's all the electricity going to come from? Oh, I think I'm being called.
Well, thank you, Eric.
Thank you for having me.